I'm going to take you back to 1922, October 1922, in a very mysterious case which was never solved, the case of the Coventry Street Vampire. Good afternoon and welcome to another edition of Untold London. My name's Dan Carrier and I'm going to take you for a little walk through the streets of central London to tell you some stories you might not have heard before. Now, it's October the 31st, so it's Halloween, so I thought I'd better find a nice scary story to share with you. So I am down in a place called Shaver's Place, right in the heart of London's West End, which leads out onto Coventry Street, and I thought this would be the best place to tell you a little story about vampires. Woo. Now, let's start off with where vampires came from. Right, okay, so firstly, you know the Count in Sesame Street. Right, the reason he has that accent, basically vampires were a Bulgarian folk story dating back to about the 13th century. So they started off in Bulgaria, Slavic folk tales essentially, and they spread through Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries and reached the shores of Great Britain around the turn of the 1700s. There'd been lots of poems written about vampires and the undead who would rise from their grave and suck your blood in the Slavic area. Now, in the 1700s, there was actually a real-life vampire terror in the Habsburg Empire in Serbia, and it was so people were so scared of vampires they actually exhumed bodies, dug up corpses, and stuck stakes through their heart. That's how scared they were of this vampire myth, which had echoed down the generations. Then we come to the big one. 1897, Bram Stoker's Dracula, the one which we relate all vampires to Dracula, but he obviously wasn't the first. It was 1897, Bram Stoker moved the action from Bulgaria to Romania. Now, Stoker's Dracula, it drew on a whole load of Victorian fears. At the time, there was a syphilis outbreak and a TB epidemic, and obviously Dracula was all about blood and sex and death, so it really did play on these Victorian fears. He sent Dracula over to Whitby Bay to stay in the Abbey there, but loads of Stoker's action actually happens right here in London. He gave Dracula a house in Piccadilly, 134 Piccadilly if you want to walk down and have a look at it. He also sets one scene on the corner of Hyde Park Corner where Jonathan and Mina, who are the two lead characters of the book, spot Dracula striding down the street, and Mina has a fainting attack because she's so scared that the vampire is here in London. There's other elements of London in the book. We know that Dracula goes for a beer up at the Spaniards Inn on Hampstead Lane, which is rumoured to be the place that Dick Turpin was based at. And there were reports in the Westminster Gazette, according to the book, that it was known as the horror of Hampstead because lots of children were being abducted in Hampstead at the time, which suggests that Dracula was feeding on the blood of young people. There's another scene in there where Abraham Van Helsing, the vampire slayer, goes out for a bit of chow at the old Jack Straw's Castle pub, which is at the top of Heath Street by Whitestone Pond in Hampstead. And he sits there and he has a meal, and he decides that night to head to St John's Graveyard, which is just down the hill, to dig up poor Lucy's body and make sure she come back as the undead. So there's loads and loads of London in Bram Stoker's book. Hardly surprising because Bram Stoker lived in London. Now, one of his jobs, and this really inspired Dracula, he was a theatre critic, right? And he worked for a man called Sir Henry Irving. Sir Henry Irving owned a newspaper. He was also an actor. Now, Sir Henry Irving gave him a job after Stoker went to see Irving do Hamlet, and he liked his to be or not to be so much. He wrote a really great review, and Irving was like, I like this young man, bring him on. So Irving gave Stoker a job as his business manager at the Lyceum Theatre. So he stopped being a theatre critic and moved over to the Lyceum. And he worked with him for 10 years. Now, apparently Irving was quite a hard taskmaster. Now, if you see like sort of etchings of Irving at the time, he's very, very tall. He's got a long face. He's got jet black hair brushed back, just like the Count should have. And he looks a bit like how you'd imagine Dracula to look. He looks quite scary. And I've got this image of poor old Stoker maybe coming in late for work one morning and Irving saying, rah, 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 and having a go at him. And you can see how scary he really was. So Stoker based his 1897 character of Dracula basically on his boss. Okay, so it's Halloween. I'm in central London. Let's talk spooky stories. I'm in Coventry Street in the heart of London's West End. You can see how busy it is around us. I'll tell you a little bit about Coventry Street and its link to vampires. Now, Coventry Street dates from about 1680. It was an area mainly drawing on commerce and entertainment. Well, that's hardly surprising because we're in the middle of central London at the time. It was full of workhouses and workshops. They make lots of leather in this area. But it was also full of pubs, breweries, gambling dens and brothels. So it was a really seedy street. You can imagine teams of people working here. It was so bad that in 1841, the editor of the Times called the street a place of infamous brothels and told the police to get on with it and do something about it. So the police went around nicking all the prostitutes along Coventry Street. Westminster magistrates got so annoyed by the amount of women showing up every morning in the dock. A magistrate told the police, and this was quoted in the Westminster Gazette of the time, that they must be allowed to walk somewhere. Now get this, in celebration, the prostitutes of Coventry Street ran up and down the street ringing on everyone's doorbells and played a massive game of Knockdown Ginger, which the Times editor the following week was really, really angry about. Now, 1850, a huge fire guts this entire street. All the buildings burned down. It started in a shoe repairer's and the whole street was razed to the ground, which meant they could rebuild it. And instead of being quite a rundown part of the West End, it became this rather grand place using Portland stone. Now, after the Great Fire of London, Christopher Wren used 6 million tonnes of Portland stone to rebuild London. Portland stone, obviously the go-to building material, so you've got lots of lovely Portland stone facades. It became quite well heeled. It still had a bit of seediness though. There was a chap called Charles Hirsch who set up a bookstore here in 1880, and it was the first place you could buy pornography in the West End apparently. He called it a Parisian library. He also sold gay literature, and Oscar Wilde was a regular customer of his. I'm going to take you back to 1922, October 1922, in a very mysterious case which was never solved, the case of the Coventry Street Vampire. Now it starts with an office clerk waking up in Charing Cross Hospital and quite unsure how he got there. A doctor approaches him and says, "Sir, you were found collapsed in the street on your way to work yesterday. You've lost an awful lot of blood." The victim turns around and says, "Oh my gosh, I remember what happened. I was coming down Coventry Street and out of an alleyway, almost invisible and shady character leapt on me, held a hanky to my throat, to my face, and I passed out." The doctors said they found 2 puncture wounds made by a small tube on his neck. Now, you'd think that their first thing would be to call a psychiatrist perhaps. It didn't really sound plausible, did it? Except on the same day, Charing Cross Hospital had 2 other people brought in, having been found collapsed on the floor by a alleyway on Coventry Street, having lost a serious amount of blood. And both those victims had 2 puncture wounds. Now the detectives were called, the police came in, the Met Police came in. They couldn't find any evidence of who did it. They couldn't find any perpetrator. London papers went mad about it. There was a vampire craze. So much so that someone went forward to the Met Police and said, "I'm a vampire slayer, I can catch the culprit for you, but what you'll have to do is exhume every single body in Highgate Cemetery and let me drive a stake through their hearts." Now, understandably, the Commissioner for the Metropolitan Police declined to take such action, and the mystery of the Coventry Street Vampire has never been solved. Remember to hit subscribe, remember to hit like. You've been listening to Untold London. Thank you for joining me.